Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for this program. My name is Carolyn Knowles, and I'm the Interim Director of Development and Alumni Relations here at the University of San Francisco School of Law. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we begin. All of the attendees, you are automatically muted when you joined, but we would really encourage you to engage with the program through the chat feature and the Q&A feature. If you experience any problems listening to this webinar, please just email lawevents@usfca.edu and we will help you out. This is also being recorded, and so we will send this to you afterwards so that you can share more widely for those who were not able to join us today. Professors Alice Kaswan and Matthew Liebman will answer your questions after they've had their conversation. And again, you can use the Q&A or the chat feature for this. With that, I would like to introduce today's speakers. Professor and Associate Dean for Faculty Scholarship, Alice Kaswan, is an expert on climate change and on environmental justice. She has written and spoken widely about climate federalism, addressing the appropriate roles of federal, state, and local governments in mitigating and adapting to climate change. Her work also explores the intersection between environmental justice and climate change policy, with special emphasis on the environmental justice implications of climate adaptation strategies and of cap and trade programs for greenhouse gases. Professor Kaswan is an elected member of the American Law Institute, a member of the Board of Directors for the Center for Progressive Reform, and a past chair of the Association of American Law Schools Environmental Law Section. Professor Matthew Liebman joined the USF faculty in 2020 as the Endowed Justice for Animals Chair and as an Associate Professor of Law. Before coming to USF, Professor Liebman was the Director of Litigation for the Animal Defense Fund, where he litigated animal protection cases, including groundbreaking cases to defend the First Amendment rights of activists and to establish fundamental legal rights for non-human animals for 12 years. Professor Liebman is a frequent media commentator on animal law issues. With Bruce Wegman, Professor Liebman co-authored the book, A Worldview of Animal Law, which examines how the legal systems of different countries govern our interactions with animals. Professor Liebman's writing has also appeared in the Animal Law Review, the Journal of Animal Law, the Stanford Environmental Law Journal, and the Animal Legal and Historical Web Center. Professor Liebman clerked for the Honorable Warren J. Ferguson of the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Thank you so much, Professor Kaswan and Professor Liebman, for joining us for this program, New Animal Justice webinar. I'll let you take it over.
Great, thanks. Well, I'll jump in. I want to thank, first of all, Carolyn and Julie in the Alumni Office for all they've done to facilitate this event. And of course, thank our co-sponsoring student organizations whose brainchild this is, especially Samantha Healy with the Student Animal Law Legal Defense Organization, and Taylor Necht with our Environmental Law Student and Alumni Society. So thank you to them for having this be their brainchild and getting this going. I'm delighted also to be co-presenting with my colleague, Professor Liebman. Between us, I think we are thinking about how we care for the environment with Professor Liebman as our scholar of animal law and a deep interest in the relationship between animals and the environment, and me with all of my focus on environmental justice and the relationships of humans to their environment. I think together we're a nice package. And I'm glad to be joining him here in thinking in particular about the non-human, and that will of course be our focus today. So I'm going to provide us with a bit of an introduction to climate change, and I will share my screen to do so. So bear with me. And let's pop that into a slideshow. All right, so assuming that some in our audience at least are not familiar with the problem of climate change, I will briefly introduce just the basic science here. So you often hear about greenhouse gases and climate change. Greenhouse gases are not gases that come out of greenhouses. The term greenhouse gas refers to the greenhouse gas effect, and that is that greenhouse gases can essentially turn the earth into a greenhouse, or the Earth and its atmosphere into a greenhouse. Those greenhouse gases, among them carbon dioxide, but also including a number of other gases like methane, which I'm sure Professor Liebman will talk about. These greenhouse gases hang out in our outer atmosphere. And then when the sun shines in, it bounces off the Earth, and historically, of course, has always radiated back out to some degree. But the greenhouse gases act as a barrier to the radiation of the sun's heat out. And that is why we see this term greenhouse gases, climate change, global warming. What we have happening is overall the globe warming because more of the sun's heat is being held in by these greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So that's the basic scientific dynamic. We do, in fact, see warming temperatures, and the chart on the right, or the charts on the right, are from the 4th National Climate Assessment. Every 4 years, the federal government does an assessment of climate impacts, and this last one was published in 2017. And it basically documents the increasing temperatures we have seen, looking at the combination of natural and human influences. And we're seeing substantial increases, largely driven by by human influences, by this, and by human influences, I mean by the emissions of greenhouse gases, as well as the loss of some of our terrestrial land sinks that we have. All right, so we do see warming temperatures, and that has a huge range of consequences. I'm not going to actually try to address all of them, but from the perspective of animals we see around the Earth, and including here in the United States, changing habitats. So the environment for animals changes as temperatures warm. That can lead to a wide range of impacts, whether it's more water, less water, sea level rise, as we'll talk about, polar vortex as the jet stream changes, changing currents in the oceans, acidification in the oceans. I'm just tripping out a whole range of different kinds of impacts that we are seeing really around the globe, and again here in the United States. And as habitats change, that changes the viability and the experience of the animals who live in those habitats. So I'm going to start off with one of the types of impacts that often gets the most attention, and that's looking at the poles, where we're seeing some of the most dramatic changes, partly because we actually have a higher rate of temperature increase in the poles and very vulnerable environments there. So here, with some photos that were reproduced in Science News, you can see the decrease between 1984 and 2016 in Arctic sea ice. This is measuring in September generally. So a massive loss of the ice that has historically been there. When you look at places like Greenland, tremendous ice melt happening there, and dramatic photos here of the water just pouring off the glaciers that cover Greenland. I don't have pictures of the Antarctic, of the other end of the Earth, but they're predicting the potential for massive ice sheets to actually slide off the land surface and enter into and melt into the seas. This, of course, has major impacts for animals who live in these regions. The polar bear has been, in some ways, the symbol of the impacts of climate change. When we look at the devastating impacts, I think this is just a horrific and tragic photo of a starving polar bear, right? As that Arctic sea ice melts, the habitat of these polar bears is gone, as well as a number of other species that live in the Arctic. But those poles and that loss of sea ice is going somewhere. It is melting and leading to sea level rise. Sea level rise is caused by both the melting of all of this ice at both ends of our Earth, as well as by increasing temperatures themselves. As you may recall from science class in 4th grade, water, when it heats up, expands. So we have thermal expansion of the oceans as well as sea level rise. And we're looking at 2100 at the possibility of significant increases in sea level rise above the levels that they were in 1992. So the intermediate range is 1.2 meters. So that would be getting close to 3.5 or 4 feet. In this projection, the highest is at about 6 or 7 feet. Many people are seeing, however, that the rate of sea level rise is already exceeding projections. So I think it's quite possible that we will end up at those highest levels by 2100, if not higher. That has enormous consequences for the habitats along all of the coasts in the world. So it has huge impacts, obviously, on the plants, on the wetlands, on the mangroves, and on the other oceanside topography. But that will also affect the many fish and animals that depend upon these wetlands. Wetlands are incredibly rich ecosystem habitat that provide the nesting grounds and the feeding grounds for many species of birds, reptiles, and fish, of course. So we are anticipating that the impact of quickly rising sea levels on these coastal habitats could be quite devastating for the animals that live in them. Here you have example also of a sea turtle. Many sea turtles around the globe are endangered, and the expectation is that we will lose many of the sea turtles as sea levels rise, as their nesting areas along the coast are depicted. So polar bears and sea turtles are often, again, the picture of climate impacts. But again, as I've mentioned, many other species will be impacted. We're also seeing already major differences in seasons as we think about these habitat impacts. So what you are seeing in the top chart from, again, the National Climate Assessment, the fourth National Climate Assessment, this is the one published in 2017, is that first leaf dates are coming sooner and first in many areas, and then coming later in a few in the Mountain West. And first bloom dates are coming sooner in many areas, and then later again in parts of the Mountain West. And this has many impacts for the relationship of species to their environments. So many of the process of coming out of hibernation or of species finding the right food at the right time is affected by the way in which the plant world, both leaves and blooms. And in some cases, it can have quite difficult consequences. Now, we may think that these animals and plants can migrate as their environment changes. For example, if they need a warmer environment, they could move to a place that offers more warmth, or if they need a cooler environment, they could move to a cooler place. So for example, we're seeing already migrations up mountains, right? As things get warmer down below, plants and animals are migrating north. And this chart shows you the ability of different kinds of plants and animals to migrate as habitat changes, with the median shown here. This is the speed at which different species can migrate over the course of a decade, looking at kilometers per decade. So some of them can go quite far, quite fast, like split-hooved mammals. Others much more slowly, rodents and primates much more slowly. So we get a big variation in the speed at which plants and animals can move. A key factor, of course, though, is going to be whether that habitat that they need to be able to move to is available to them, right? In many cases, it may be populated by other species, or it may have been subject to development that does not allow for the migration of the animal in question. So again, technically, we would hope that animals who are discovering that the leaf bloom is at the wrong time for them, for example, would be able to move to a place where it might be at a more appropriate time. But that ability to migrate, again, is slow and can be blocked by many factors. This is just a vivid portrayal of what happens if the environment changes in a way that's not sustainable for a species. So you see the white hare here. It's a hare that has always lived in a snow-covered environment, but now the snow is melting in the area where it has always been, obviously making it much more vulnerable to predators than it was before. So you can see here that the brown hare is going to survive much better in this changing environment, changes due to climate change, than the white-haired rabbit, unless that white-haired rabbit is able to migrate higher up to places where the snow may persist for longer, if indeed it persists at all. All right, we're also going to see huge changes in water levels in the upper Midwest and in the Northeast. They're expecting more water, so they're going to have less drought. So that's why you see there's sort of less drought in those areas. But when you look at the Southwest, you are seeing expectations of much less precipitation looking forward to some degree at extreme levels, right? We're talking about a drought levels that could increase, drought months that could increase quite substantially over the foreseeable future. So droughts have huge consequences for animals. I'm going to talk first about fish. So when you have a drought, obviously there's less water. So clearly that's an impact on fish. Droughts also will lead to warmer water, because when you have less water, it warms up more. And when you have warmer water, that has quite substantial impacts for fish, because fish are not only dependent on the volume of water, but also on certain water temperatures, and that can really impact them. So I have just an example of the delta smelt here, which is affected by a number of factors. It's in the Bay Delta, so I'm talking about our own delta here. This particular fish is affecting many issues around how we treat the Bay Delta in the future, and the relationship between agriculture, locally agriculture as we pump water south, and the well-being of the species that have long lived in the Bay Delta. The Delta smelt is now endangered, right? Its populations have crashed, in part due to drought, which again has become more severe in California, linked in some ways to, or predictably linked to climate change, but also to pumping and other factors. The salmon that you hear so much about all the time, and that has an incredibly high cost if you go to fish markets now, is many species of salmon are becoming endangered. And again, that's due to multiple factors, but it's not just overfishing. A very significant factor is decreases in water and increased warming of water. So you look not only at California, but also in Washington State, in Alaska, and the combination of less water and warmer waters having very significant impacts on Pacific salmon. And again, that's been a very important fishing industry in terms of human impacts, but also obviously impacts on the fish themselves, as well as the other species that are being impacted by the warmer waters. Heat and drought also contribute to enhanced fire risk. So temperatures are rising, as we know. In the Western United States, they've increased an average of 1.9, so almost 2 degrees Fahrenheit by average since 1970. And that's not counting heat waves and periods where the temperatures are often much higher than they have been in the past. We're also in many years getting less snow, so we have more drought, but we're also getting faster snow melt, which means we get this rush of water in the spring, and then our summers are drier than they used to be because we have less snow melt happening over the course of the summer. Our forests are drier for longer. They're actually, as a consequence of the higher temperatures, also more subject to disease, which weakens them, kills them, and also makes them more likely to burn. So if any of you have heard about I'm forgetting what kind of beetle it is, but there's a beetle that has just been ravishing the Western forests and killing many trees. And that is another reason why they have, at least at the forest level, not in the scrub areas, been burning it was such devastating effect. So animals tremendously affected by fire, right? We often focus on the homes and the people that are being impacted, or locally, we've certainly focused on the smoke and its health impacts. But animals are immediate victims of fires, as well as long-term victims as their habitats are destroyed. I have here just a place where they did a fair amount of study about this over 1919 to 1920, and not 2019 to 2020. Australia was racked by fires in the bush, and the World Wildlife Fund did some assessment of the impact to animal life of those bushfires. And they calculate that 3 billion animals were harmed through that, many killed in that process. And again, as we look forward to the devastating habitat impacts, we can imagine that there are many more animals that will succumb, as well as many that that will not exist because as a consequence of those fires. I've been talking about animals in general. I think it's important to recognize that animals in general will be significantly impacted by climate change, whether it means they go extinct or not. But I want to now focus specifically on extinction. And many people, when they talk about climate change and animals, focus really only on extinction. But it's expected that climate change, again, this is CNN, but there's a study that came out that anticipated that climate change would doom 1 in 3 species of plants and animals in the next 50 years. So that's including both plants and animals. But these radical changes in habitat and the inability of the animals and plants to be able to move and adapt to those changes could lead to what they consider I think it's the 6th major wave of extinction that the planet has seen, right? We had the asteroid hit when the dinosaurs left. That was a major wave of extinction, and climate change may cause another such wave of extinction and associated biodiversity loss. What do we do about all this? When we're in the climate change world and you want to be savvy about the lingo, you can talk about climate change mitigation. That's about how do we reduce emissions. And indirectly, when Matthew talks about the way that the way our agriculture treats animals, one of our mitigation mechanisms may be to try to control that. So that's how do we reduce greenhouse gases to eliminate them, to lessen them at least, in ways that will reduce these impacts. The other thing, though, that we are having to work on, and that's what I'll talk about a little bit more, is what we call adaptation. We know these impacts are happening and are going to happen to animals and others. So how do we adapt to them? And so you see here a cartoon that is depicting what we often call assisted migration, right? So in some cases, in the public lands context, we're looking at whether we actually need to help animals migrate, right? If there is a town in between where they are now, which is unsustainable, and where they need to go in order to be able to survive, are we going to have to buy land where these animals can survive and then carry them over there, right? So assisted migration is one mechanism, just to give you an example of how we might work on adapting. And there are many, many others, but that gives you an image of what we're talking about here. I want to look just briefly at our laws, right? How does our legal system going to address this? So a fair amount is going to be managed through public lands and waters management. The degree to which we actually deal with impacts on animals may depend to some degree on the mission of the agency, right? You're going to have a different kind of mission if you're under the Department of Interior and dealing with a park or wilderness area from a situation where you're dealing with land managed by the Bureau of Land Management or our national forests, which are actually run by the Department of Agriculture. So the degree to which we're going to actually do something about the impacts on animals may vary on mission. Now, there are a couple different ways you can, for the most part, you're going to be taking a proactive approach here. These are not regulatory programs. They are sort of how do we improve the environment kinds of programs. So procedurally, already you're seeing various kinds of assessments that have been done over the last 10 years of the impacts of climate change on animals, as well as the environments of these public lands and waters more generally, and then some degree of strategic planning. What are we going to do? So those are sort of the procedural aspects. Substantively, we're looking at, in general, how do we protect habitats? That might mean how do we protect wetlands, right? There may be ways we can help a wetland shift or actually protect them, how we help deal with forest management or other things to improve conditions. Or in some cases, we may be dealing with more species-tailored responses as we look at impacts on particular species like assisted migration. So that's public lands. Again, you're mostly going to have a proactive, adaptive approach there. We also have environmental review statutes that generally require us to evaluate the impacts of, in the federal level, federal projects on the environment. We also have equivalents in the state. There's some question about how thorough these impacts assessments are if we're talking about non-endangered species. Endangered species definitely have to be accounted for, but if they're not endangered, again, I'd say there's a little bit of a question about, how much we pay attention. But that's certainly an area where we can start to at least evaluate and make more transparent the impacts on animals. No, not much substantive weight here, but at least knowledge that might affect how we act. In terms of actual legal mechanisms that could do something here, the Endangered Species Act is probably our most substantive mechanism for addressing the impacts of climate change on animals. Projects in general cannot jeopardize endangered species, including the habitat they need. You have to take my environmental law class if you want more information about that, because that's much more nuanced than what I just said, but that's the general idea. And often, whether you're a federal agency or a private developer, if you are going to have an impact, you have to come up with what we call a habitat conservation plan or its equivalent to try to mitigate the potential harm on that species. So there are mechanisms to deal with impacts on endangered species and major questions about the role that climate change will play and forecasting future climate will play in how we try to mitigate the harm that we expect from a project. I think I don't want to take up too much time. I'm just going to note that in 2019, there were some regulatory changes that could reduce protection for threatened species, both making them harder to list as threatened species and reducing the protections they receive if they're listed. I'm not going to go into them. But again, in my environmental law class, we'll talk about those briefly. But now we may be seeing some regulatory changes. These may be the kinds of regulations that we see shifting back to their earlier approaches. So we'll have to see what comes in 2021 or soon thereafter with the new administration in place. Expect this to be an incredibly dynamic year in environmental law, including the law that addresses animals. With that, I'm going to leave at least a couple of minutes for my colleague, Professor Liebman, and I will stop sharing my screen. I think we'll take questions after both of us have had a chance to present.
Right, thank you, Professor Kaswan. Give me just a second here. Get my presentation up. Let's see. Oh. Okay, so, right, so Professor Kaswan talked about how climate change is harming animals. I'm going to be focusing on how harming animals contributes to climate change, and specifically about the contributions of animal agriculture to climate change. And to really, I think, appreciate the environmental impact of animal agriculture, it's important to understand its magnitude. So animal agriculture is a truly massive human endeavor. 320 million tons of terrestrial animals are eaten each year, another 150 million tons of sea creatures. The average American eats 220 pounds of meat per year. That's the weight of meat, but we also ought to talk about the number of animal lives involved in animal agriculture. More than 70 billion land animals are killed annually. If you add sea creatures, that number rises into the trillions. Specifically, we're talking about 60 billion chickens globally, 1.5 billion pigs, 500 million sheep, 450 million goats, 300 million cows. And so those numbers are significant and they're rising. So if you take a look at this chart, it shows significant growth throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century of the number of animals. And this graph represents the number of livestock animals measured as the number of live animals at a single point in any given year. So in any given year, we have more than 1.5 billion cows on this planet. This graphic illustrates the biomass of mammals on the planet Earth. That is the weight of all living mammals. That's I'm sorry? Oh, sorry, I heard some noise. That's every tiger, every elephant, every human, every cow. And if you add that up, 60% of the weight of mammalian life on this planet is livestock. Another 36% is humans, and just 4% of the mammalian weight or biomass on this planet is wild animals. In the context of birds, 70% of the biomass of birds is farmed chickens and turkeys. Just 30% are wild birds. So for every pigeon or sparrow or blue jay that you see, there's more than 2 more chickens or turkeys who are being raised for food. Here's another way of illustrating the fact that most of the mammals on this planet are raised for food. So there are a lot of animals, just numerically, who are raised and slaughtered for food globally, and especially in the United States. What does the process of raising them look like? So you might remember these advertisements from a few years ago. The slogan was "Great cheese comes from happy cows come from California." But if we're raising more than 70 billion animals globally for food, we just don't have the land to do it the way these advertisements misleadingly suggest that it's done. In fact, what animal agriculture really looks like is more like this. It's thousands of animals crammed into feedlots and industrial facilities, which are called concentrated animal feeding operations. And the idyllic farm with rolling green hills has been replaced by corporate agribusiness, where as many animals as possible are confined into as small of a space as possible to reap the maximum profits. This happens not just with cows, but also with pigs, as you can see here, with chickens and turkeys. And really the vast majority of meat that's raised in the United States and increasingly globally, it comes from these kinds of factory farms that produce the millions of tons of meat that's consumed globally. This is a vertical factory farm that's currently under construction in China. It's been referred to as a pig hotel, which is probably putting it a little nicely. This facility will house 30,000 mother pigs who will be producing as many as 840,000 piglets annually, making it the biggest, most intensive breeding farm in the world. And that's a lot of pigs. To think of 30,000 pigs producing almost 1 million more pigs annually, that is a lot of animals. And as biological creatures, we have to think about what is it that pigs do that's going to really produce an environmental problem. Well, what does everyone do? Everyone poops. So the real heart of the problem with animal agriculture as it relates to climate, or a large part of it, has to do with feces. So the average cow produces about 45 pounds of manure every day. The average pig produces about 11 pounds a day of manure. By comparison, the average human produces about 1/4 of a pound a day. So a pig produces about 40 times the amount of feces as a human being. So when we have 70 billion land animals raised for food every year, that's a lot of manure to deal with. And in fact, in just one region of North Carolina, a very concentrated pig producing region, there are 7.5 million hogs that produce more than 15 million tons of feces every year. And here's how that gets dealt with on the farm. So this is a factory farm in North Carolina. Those long barns are intensively confined pigs. They have slatted floors so that when they poop, it goes through the floor and then it gets drained into these purple lagoons that you see there. Those are called manure lagoons, and they essentially collect liquid manure from the animals that are confined there. And you'll see similar things at dairies as well. The liquid manure then gets sprayed onto fields like this one as a means of disposal and fertilization. but it's incredibly environmentally harmful. So when it rains or just the over application of this liquid manure to these fields, that runoff goes into local groundwater and rivers and streams. It's also incredibly bad for air quality because, as you see from these kind of sprinkler systems that spray the liquid manure on these fields, it essentially aerosolizes the feces that spreads to surrounding communities, which presents an environmental justice or environmental racism issue. The majority of these facilities are sited in rural and low income, often communities of color. This is a woman named Naima Mohammed with a group called the North Carolina Environmental Justice Network. And they've been organizing around this issue for years, fighting the factory farming company Smithfield Foods over the environmentally racist effects of the pig CAFOs and the spraying of manure, which is disproportionately affecting the health and property values of the surrounding Black and brown communities. So in addition to the water and air quality problems that all this feces creates, there's also, as the topic of today suggests, a huge climate impact. All that animal waste creates a very potent greenhouse gas called methane. And the methane that's coming off of these manure facilities, off of those lagoons, those purple kind of swimming pool looking things that you saw, it's so voluminous and it's so concentrated that it can actually be lethal, as you see here from this headline, where a farmer and his son actually died from the methane, the fumes coming off of the manure pit on their pig farm. So this is methane. It's considered a short-lived climate pollutant, which means it stays in the atmosphere for less time than carbon dioxide, which is the main greenhouse gas. Carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for more than 300 years. Methane, by comparison, only stays in the atmosphere for about 12 years. But in those 12 years, it's much more, has a much greater impact on warming. So according to the EPA, pound for pound, the comparative impact of methane is 25 times greater than CO2 over a 100-year period. According to the Environmental Defense Fund, in the first 2 decades after its release, methane is 84 times more potent than carbon dioxide. So it doesn't stick around for as long, but it's very powerful at trapping heat within the atmosphere in a way that leads to that greenhouse gas effect, the greenhouse effect that Professor Kaswan was talking about. Methane accounts for about 16% of global greenhouse gas emissions compared to about 76% for CO2. So it's not as voluminous as CO2, but it is a huge part of the picture and can have incredibly important impacts on global climate change. This represents the US methane emissions by source. Those manure lagoons, you see the manure management slice of the pie there is about 10%. So about 10% of methane emissions come from those manure lagoons, the management of those facilities and the methane that they off-gas as a result of that. And the other 28% of methane that's attributable to animal agriculture is that 28% for enteric fermentation. And that's a fancy way of talking about mostly burps, but farts as well. So cows and other ruminants, when they digest their food, naturally produce methane as part of the digestive process and as part of microbial fermentation. So as they digest the sugars in the food that they eat, they naturally produce gas, and about 95% of that they burp out. The other 5% comes out the other side. And that is a direct emission from the animals themselves, creating very significant methane emissions that actually are more voluminous than what's coming off of those manure lagoons. So between the manure lagoons and enteric fermentation from ruminants like cows, there's a large amount of global and US methane emissions that are directly attributable to diet, to the livestock industry. So we've talked about methane, but of course, CO2 is the main greenhouse gas emission, the main greenhouse gas, and animal ag is responsible there as well. So the direct emissions of CO2 from animal agriculture aren't as significant as the methane emissions, but what's perhaps more important than the direct emissions when it comes to carbon is the way that animal agriculture transforms landscapes, primarily through deforestation. In the Amazon in particular, you see the destruction of habitat, especially rainforests, to either create grasslands for grazing or to create monocropping of soy and corn, which is in turn fed to animals on feedlots and factory farms. So we see through here the transformation of the environment in ways that undermine the ability of the earth to essentially heal itself. Those trees that have been deforested to make way for either grazing or monocropping of crops that are used as animal feed eliminates their ability to pull carbon out of the air, right? So if you remember from basic biology, what plants do is they absorb CO2 from the atmosphere. And for that reason, places like the Amazon and rainforests have been referred to as the lungs of the planet, right? They're removing all of that carbon from the atmosphere. But if we're deforesting in order to make way for animal agriculture, we're removing the ability of the earth to suck that CO2 out of the atmosphere and absorb emissions from other industries. So it's not just about how does animal agriculture directly contribute to emissions, but also how does its transformation of the landscape of the planet undermine the ability of the earth to regulate the temperature. So this is a graphic that shows the role of food production in global emissions. So here you see that about 74% of our emissions are not related to food. So we're not talking about that right now, but about 26% of our global emissions are food related. And then the land that's used for livestock, the growing of crops for animal feed, and then the direct emissions that come from livestock itself are responsible for a very significant amount of our global emissions. Another way another fact that I think is significant here, if you combine the emissions of the top 5 meat and dairy companies, they emit more greenhouse gases than ExxonMobil, Shell, or British Petroleum independently. If you add up the emissions of the top 20 meat and dairy companies, they emit more greenhouse gases than Germany, Canada, Australia, the UK, or France. So it is a really significant portion of the problem. Let's take a minute to talk about the regulatory framework here in California. California does have laws and regulations that target statewide emissions, and those statutes and regulations do include methane in addition to CO2. There was a law passed a few years ago, SB 1383, that directs the California Air Resources Board to reduce methane emissions 40% below 2013 levels by 2030. Here's that statute. But currently there are no actual numerical requirements. Right now they're currently in the working group phase where they're studying the problem, looking at what sort of market-based solutions might solve the problem, but there aren't direct in fact, there's not even enough knowledge about how much methane any given farm is releasing to be able to create liability at the farm by farm level. So at this point, it's really the state is kind of studying the problem and trying to find incentive-based solutions to figure out how to reduce methane emissions. California's approach to regulating it and really kind of globally, the approach has been largely technocratic, focusing on things like methane digesters or biogas digesters. That's what you see here in this picture, that would essentially capture the methane coming off of farms, off of manure lagoons, and then turning it into usable energy. But environmental and public health organizations like the Sierra Club and Food and Water Watch are skeptical of this as a solution, in part because they're not very efficient. They only capture about 50% of the methane coming off of a lagoon. But they also lock in the factory farming CAFO model, which is energy intensive and environmentally destructive in its own right. So the Sierra Club writes, CAFO waste streams are so large and contaminated that methane digesters mitigate only a small fraction of their environmental damage. Food and Water Watch says, in reality, methane digesters have negligible impacts on the deep environmental problems caused by factory farms, and if anything, serve to further entrench this disastrous method of food production. So California's approach is largely focused on creating incentives to create these methane digesters, but the problem really runs a lot deeper than just the gas that's coming off of these lagoons. Another proposed solution has been on the enteric fermentation side, which is changing the diets that are fed to animals. So giving them things like lemongrass or seaweed. But the science on this is not really clear that it actually does reduce methane emissions from burping in any significant way. And again, this sort of locks in the model of a feedlot where you're actually controlling what animals eat, where you're feeding them a controlled diet rather than allowing grazing. And it would also lead to monocropping of seaweed, which could be disastrous for the oceans in its own right. So I think there's a simpler solution, and so does the UN, at least in part. They're recommending simply eating less meat. If we reduce that 70 billion land animals who are killed every year for food, we would reduce the carbon and other greenhouse gas footprints of our diets. There's a special report on climate change in the land from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, that did in fact encourage a reduction in meat for all the reasons that we've discussed, because of its impact on the climate, because of the methane emissions, because of the transformation of agriculture, transformation of landscapes for agriculture. So the UN is recommending shifts to a plant-based diet in large part. This is a chart of the greenhouse gas mitigation potential of various diets. And you can see that a vegan diet with no animal products is considered the best diet for climate, with double the environmental benefit compared to, for example, the pescatarian diet, or a diet that has moderate amounts of meat like the Mediterranean diet. Here's another way of looking at that. This study found that a high meat diet produces 2.5 times more greenhouse gas emissions than a vegan equivalent. And here again is another representation of that. Plant-based foods have a much smaller carbon footprint and a smaller methane footprint compared to animal products. And I do think that individual actions like adopting a vegan diet or changing your light bulbs, all of those are important, but I don't want to sort of fall into that trap of suggesting that solving climate change is an individual choice, that if we all just sort of made personal sacrifices, we could change this problem. I think there's no doubt that what we need is collective action and governmental action. Hopefully that will be coming if we rejoin the Paris Accord and start to work collectively to solve this problem. But I do think there is a level of individual contribution to the solution, and that personal dietary choices can play a significant role in that. So let me just conclude by saying that if you are interested in trying to adopt a plant-based diet or eat less meat to help mitigate your carbon footprint, I'd recommend this website, veganoutreach.org, which has great resources, including recipes, some nutritional information, and a 10-week starter program for people who are interested in transitioning to adopting a more climate-friendly diet. Here's my email address if anyone wants to get in touch about anything in this presentation or about the Justice for Animals program more broadly. And I will leave it there. And I know we've got a little bit of time left for questions.
Thank you so much to both of you. I see that we have one question that says, can you speak on cultivated meat or meat made from animal cells in labs? Do you think it will dramatically impact CAFOs or the environment in the near future?
Do you want me to take that one, Professor Kaswan?
Yes.
So that's a great question. And this, for those who are not familiar with this trend, there's a kind of scientific technological move to create cell-based meat products, where essentially you take a cell from an animal and reproduce it currently in a laboratory, but in the future it would be a more sort of industrial process where you're essentially growing meat without the animal. And I think that would be great from an animal welfare perspective. I think encouraging people to shift to a vegan diet is great, but there's certainly a lot of people who don't want to go there and might be willing to eat cultured meat. I do think from an environmental perspective, it's not clear what the trade-off is it's currently very resource intensive to do that, but I think as it scales, the ecology of it is going to be a little bit different. And if you're not, if you don't have live animals who are producing manure, who are burping, you're certainly going to reduce the climate impact. But from a resource input side perspective, it's not clear whether that's going to be environmentally more friendly than meat, but it would be hard to be less environmentally friendly than meat. So I think it's a shift in the right direction, but it's still kind of early in the science and the economics of it, and it's going to depend how technologically it develops and how intensive the resource inputs are.
Definitely. We have a question from Megan Walsh. Do you have any data on food waste, either the proportion of produced food wasted and the climate impact of wasted food? This could be for either Professor Kaswan or Professor Liebman.
I'll first say hi, Megan. I can't see you, but it's nice to picture you out there. You know, I know food waste is a significant source of methane, among other things. So one of the other sources of methane that we often look at are landfills, municipal landfills, and food waste is clearly a significant source. But the percentage, I don't know offhand, and I don't have that offhand. And I know that, you know, folks who are worried about the environment and about climate change are looking at ways to divert food waste by encouraging people to, especially if it's in a restaurant context or a catering context, whether there are ways to get those to people who need food. Because again, we have not only the environmental, but also the social justice implications of food waste, that there are people who are hungry, and then, you know, why would we be wasting food in that context? Many places also are looking at composting, and sometimes for different motivations. Sometimes it's because they don't have a place to put their waste, and they're trying to just divert as much as they can from the waste stream to avoid burdening the land with waste. But other places, I know here where I live in Berkeley, we have very aggressive or well-organized composting, which takes both gardening waste as well as food waste and composts it, which if you do in a controlled way can reduce the methane emissions that ultimately emerge from that waste.
Great, thank you. I have a question from Taylor Knecht. I hope I pronounced your last name correctly, Taylor. And I find this one really interesting too. Growing up in Montana, where there were a lot of trout that were put in different streams that were not native to Montana. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one. If species do migrate to new areas or habitats through assisted migration or on their own accord, is there a possibility that these non-native species will negatively affect the native species there, as well as the makeup of the ecosystem itself, including vegetation, soil, etc.? Who would like to answer this one?
I think that falls to me, right? I think we're talking about the indirect impacts of climate change. Again, they're not only the immediate impacts on the species that are being affected by the change in their own habitats, but the way in which those species, as they migrate to survive, affect the habitats to which they migrate. When it happens naturally, so to speak, then, well, how do I put this? There are, in the public lands agencies, those are going to be important issues they have to address, both of them really. Anytime you're looking at assisted migration, I'm sure they're doing environmental assessments of that assisted migration, and one of those assessments would have to include the impact on the habitats to which you're moving the species. And so no question, and they could be ones that outweigh the value of assisting, right? So whether it's a public lands agency that is proposing it or in some other context. In terms of the natural migration, I would imagine that to the degree they're doing assessments of climate impacts on animals, they are also looking
Has Alice frozen on us?
I think so.
All right. Maybe we'll move on to another question. This is a follow-up one, Professor Liebman, from Susan Gilbert Miller about reducing methane from factory meat farming. She says that she understands that meat is actually increasing in China, the eating of it. And she just wants to know other thoughts on other ways of reducing methane from factory meat farming.
Yeah, and I saw the first part of your question as well, Susan, about whether we can sort of, given the limitations on people's willingness to wear masks, can we expect them to also be willing to make, personal sacrifices? And that's one of the big challenges with climate change. And how do we change norms? How do we nudge people in directions that are going to reduce the effect of climate change? And I think that's as much of a social, political question as it is a legal question. And it's easy to get pessimistic about it, and I sometimes do. So I don't know, there are some, as I discussed, technocratic fixes, things like methane digesters. There are other sort of methods of waste separation and waste treatment that might reduce methane, what you feed animals, but all of that is really going to be a drop in the bucket if we don't sort of get a handle on the increased demand for meat. And as you say, in other parts of the country, that demand is rising, or other parts of the world, that demand is rising even more significantly than it is here. And it may be that sort of shifting to more climate-friendly diets is part of it. And there's a lot that governments can do to sort of incentivize that through public education, through changing where they're allocating their subsidies. There are massive subsidies for factory farming by governments around the world, including in the United States. There's a program where the government gives low interest or no interest loans to build factory farms. So I think sort of looking at sort of systematically how we're actually subsidizing the creation of this factory farming system is going to be incredibly important. And I don't know if there's reason to be optimistic, but I do think there's a lot that could be done to mitigate both the demand side and as maybe stopgap measures, things like reducing the impact of methane in the short term.
Thank you so much. We have time for just one more question, and your answer actually leads very well into this final question from Andrew Ogden, where he asks, can you identify one or two actions that the new administration could take through executive or agency action that would jumpstart mitigation of methane emissions from CAFO sources?
Yeah, Professor Kaswan is really the expert on climate policy. I think there's as I just mentioned, there are things that the federal government is doing that could be changed in terms of incentivizing this industry, sort of withdrawing those and putting research funds into other areas that would be more climate friendly. But to begin with, just rejoining the Paris Accord and starting to participate in a global conversation about how to tackle this problem is really important. But I'm really curious what Professor Kaswan would have on her wish list for the short term.
I think you are muted, Professor Kaswan.
I'm less of an expert on what we would do in the agriculture sector, but I think, looking at the way we regulate factory farming altogether, right? Thinking holistically about the waste stream and how that waste is handled. I think there are ways in which it is environmentally unsustainable, and that under, for example, the Clean Water Act, we have not adequately regulated the stream. Again, in most contexts, we're not looking at biogas production, an expensive investment. So in the short term, I don't know whether there are also just ways to regulate CAFOs that lead to both better conditions for the animals and less of a adverse impact from their waste, right? Part of it is the way that we handle it. If we control the way that they handle it more, we said you can't be creating these waste streams that go into these lagoons and the like, then that might actually create some indirect brakes on the process as a whole. So that's one. I'm seeing from Susan Gilbert Miller, another wonderful graduate, that that the Biden administration is probably going to be looking in the agricultural sector at subsidies for carbon sequestration. We know, as Professor Liebman said, that forests and certain kinds of plants will absorb carbon, and that we're going to actually have to rely on our landscape to address the absorption of emissions and trying to encourage the absorption of emissions. So in the agricultural sector overall, we can see trying to bring them into the fold of being a positive force for sequestering and capturing more of those carbon emissions. But that doesn't relate to the emissions coming so much from the factory farms. I would love to see more aggressive regulation of factory farming altogether, which I think might help, possibly increase the costs, but ultimately stem the consequences. I am, however, a little not that optimistic that the current administration will aggressively tackle that area. I think the farming industry is one that often has tremendous political influence, and for the people who rely on that industry, they're a powerful force. And as with anything we do, we have to think about transitions. If they're not going to be doing that, what will they be doing? And so I think it's a sort of holistic issue about how we deal with farming in this country and how we deal with the politics of farming in this country that has to be grappled with before we see real action on that front.
Thank you so much to both of you. I see we're just 2 minutes over, but this was really valuable content. And just thank you so much to Professor Kaswan and Professor Liebman for taking this hour to speak about these really important issues. It was really informative. So thank you so much. And thank you. I'm sorry.
I just want a last thank you to Samantha and Taylor, because again, this was really their brainchild. And so I'm glad that we could come forward on.
Wonderful. And this is being recorded so we can share it broadly for anyone who was not able to join us now. But thank you again to everyone who helped to coordinate this, and be well and safe, everyone.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.